France under surveillance. A new bill which gives intelligence services sweeping powers while bypassing the judiciary is causing controversy. But is it necessary? What about personal freedoms and privacy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, it's often said that governments use moments of national catastrophe or turmoil to pass heavy-handed new laws or strengthen existing ones, all in the name of empowering their security services. Well, France may have done just that by passing a far-reaching new surveillance bill. Its supporters say attacks like the one on the offices of Charlie Hebdo show it's necessary. The bill would allow intelligence agencies to tap phones and emails without going to a judge. Though it received overwhelming support from Parliament, rights groups are deeply concerned. Before we speak to our guests, Al Jazeera's Niamh Barker sets things up from Paris.
Security patrols outside the French Parliament ahead of the crucial vote. Since the attacks in Paris 4 months ago, France has been on a heightened state of alert.
Le scrutin est clos.
And now further increases in national security as politicians from across the political spectrum vote to broaden state surveillance powers.
Majorité absolue.
The legislation would allow spy agencies to tap phones and emails without the need for permission from a judge. It would require internet companies to monitor suspicious activity, employing so-called black boxes to filter communications. The government also wants to spend $450 million to recruit extra security and intelligence officers. While lawmakers here at the French Parliament vote resoundingly in favour of the new digital surveillance bill, here next door in the opulent surroundings of the Foreign Ministry, journalists have been invited to discuss and celebrate freedom of expression online. Spot the irony. But is it really possible to balance state security with internet freedom? Here, opinions are divided.
We need these safeguards, but we also need to make sure freedom of speech is protected. It's very complicated. We have to get it right.
Several leading journalists and civil rights groups believe the law could lead to abuses of power, while internet companies say the changes will frighten away customers.
I think the law should not have opened this door to abuse. And we know very well, and the history of France, but of the whole world, is full of cases where Secret Service, where intelligence organizations have abused the law with or without the political power support.
Now that it's flown through Parliament, the new surveillance bill is almost certain to become law. While threat levels remain high, so too is the desire for greater state controls. Niamh Barker, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Let's bring in our guests now into the show. In Paris, we have Gaurie van Gulik, Amnesty International's Deputy Director for Europe and Central Asia. In Derby, Vidya Ramalingam, a Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who focuses on far-right extremism. And in Paris, Renard Girard, a Chief Correspondent at Le Figaro newspaper. Welcome to you all. We're going to start with Vidya. What do you think? Will this law make France safer?
Well, the challenge with the securitized approach where intelligence and police lead on measures to counter extremism is that they can actually lead to incredibly high levels of mistrust amongst the communities that actually we should be building relationships with to push out extremism. So actually, in some cases, excessive surveillance can actually be counterproductive to counter extremism tactics.
But why Vidya? I mean, I guess the supporters of this law would argue if people don't have anything to fear from cameras being placed, why would they clam up on themselves?
Well, actually, the thing is that communities themselves can be incredibly powerful actors in preventing and countering extremism. So if we actually invest this money, the 425 million that the French government has pledged on police and on spies and investigators, if actually we can invest some of that money into building the right networks between social services, communities themselves, schools even, to reach the vulnerable individuals, actually that money might be better spent.
All right, let's bring in Renaud into this discussion. Does France need a new law, Renaud?
First, I don't believe that fanaticism or Islamism, radical Islamism, is linked with poverty. I don't believe that. I mean, the authors of the attacks in Washington, in New York in September 2001 were from middle-class background, and the authors of the crimes in January, the attacks in Paris, were not vulnerable. They had good education, they were well integrated, they had been protected by social services in France, and they were not like vulnerable. So I don't believe at all that there is a link between poverty and fanaticism. This is one point. The second point is that it's true that the police ask for better tools actually the special services were monitoring suspects and people, but now they wanted to do it in a legal frame. It's just what all this law is about, to put a legal frame to the monitoring, the taping.
I guess my question, Renaud, was why is a new legal frame needed?
And you have to, yeah, because it has been requested by the security services. You have like very big threats in France. You have like, you know, Jewish schools who have been targeted as Jewish, which is very serious. I mean, it never happened in France that Jews are targeted as Jews. And so we need a better level of monitoring for special services. And actually, they were doing it in some ways, but out a legal frame. And yes, I think that the French democratic society has been attacked,
okay,
and has to protect itself.
All right,
so
let's bring in.
Let's bring just remember that people that the final word will be to judges. I mean,
that's an interesting point. I think there's a lot to say on that, whether really judges will have the final word on this one. But before we get into that, I'm curious to know from Goris' perspective, I mean, if we look at what's being proposed in this law, some aspects of it, for example, include mass data collection. Looking at it from the perspective of other countries which have kind of gone through this now, what does the experience say? Does it say that when you give security services strengthened powers, mass surveillance, mass data collection, it strengthens security without abusing individual rights?
Well, what's very important to say first is that this law goes well beyond counterterrorism. I think we're forgetting that sometimes. This is not just about counterterrorism, protecting the state from and people from terrorism. It's incredibly broad. It's a sweeping law that also has other broad, vague aims, including foreign policy, for example. Let's also remember that it's not just the security services who can ask for this, but also other ministries, customs, for example. It's incredibly sweeping and broad. So this is the first major problem with this bill, and then there's many others. But as you rightly asked, you know, we've seen this in other countries, of course, thinking especially of the United States, but also the United Kingdom. And what's interesting to note is that even the United States, which has the most sweeping law as well, and is focused on counterterrorism, but goes very far in its surveillance, the Patriot Act, even the United States is having discussions on going back on some of those large-scale surveillance powers. So I think it's a very strange moment now for France to go this far with such a broad law that really needs narrowing down and defining for it to be effective and for it to be legal.
All right, Renaud, you raised a point there which I want to explore with you more. You said that the final oversight is a judicial one. That is not the fact, is it? There is a panel, the CNCTR supervisory panel, which is supposed to oversee the supervision operations. That is not a judicial body. It's a panel of 13 people. Even its decisions are not necessarily binding because the Prime Minister can overrule it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the Prime Minister will want to overrule it.
But he can, that's the point, isn't it? He can, it gives him the right to do so.
He can, yes, you're right on that point, he can. But my point was that then, okay, you can monitor my call, for instance, though there is a law that forbids in France, another law that forbids to listen to journalists, so they cannot listen to my calls, but they can listen to the call of the shoemaker living next to me, and but then it's only a judge who can use this material to indict or not to indict the citizen. So this is a big difference. And the second limit is that the security services are only allowed to tape and to type and to register the matter linked to the suspicion of terrorism. If the shoemaker living next to me has got an extramarital affair and wants to hide it, the security services are not allowed, because it's not linked to any terrorism, are not allowed to type it down. So you can be monitored, but only for the activities linked to a suspicion of terrorism.
Right, I can see Gowrie is shaking her head there, so I want to give you a chance to come back in on this. Is it enough to say, look, ultimately no one's going to go to jail unless a judge approves it? Might we not see scenarios where people will live extended periods under surveillance for no good reason before a judge becomes involved?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two distinct issues. One is the issue of surveillance itself, being monitored, being followed, being traced, and then what happens with that information. But first, on the surveillance itself, it's very vague in terms of when exactly someone can be monitored and traced, and that includes bugging cars, bugging phones. I mean, this is very excessive. It's not just online, it's also offline, it's both. It's vague because it says that you can be monitored if you have any communication with a person who is under the suspicion of, etc. And that means that you don't have to be under suspicion of, right? You don't have to be yourself even aware of this person being under suspicion. So it's incredibly broad. And the second point is there's this provision that's very important that talks about communication abroad with external, so people outside of France. The reason I mention that is because any communication you have in France goes often via servers abroad. What we saw in the United Kingdom, for example, in the discussions around the Act, is that means that in fact all traffic can fall under the definition. And that is an incredibly sweeping provision that needs to be narrowed down as well. So a couple of clarifications there. But just to be clear, for me, it's already important surveillance in and of itself. It's not just about what happens next. And there is no judicial oversight whatsoever when it comes to the actual tracing, monitoring of online and offline behavior of people under this law.
Vidya, there are, the law does specify the sort of grounds upon which perhaps security services would want to engage in surveillance. Some of the obvious ones of, protecting national security and preventing terrorism. Who gets to, is there a problem or is there a fear here with who gets to decide who is a radical? How is that being defined by security agencies? When you look at the Europol reports, the European Union police force that tracks what governments classify, not us in the media or analysts, what governments classify as terrorism in Europe, you find year after year, at least for the last 5 years of reports I've read, the #1 perpetrators of terrorism in Europe, up to a peak of 76% in some years, are actually the nationalists, the separatists, the far right. Are those the people that are going to be targeted with this sort of surveillance powers? Or are we going to see the targeting more of other groups who are contributing less to the problem of terrorism?
Just one point worth mentioning is even if the legal framework here wasn't vague, a legal framework is only as good as its implementation. And history has shown us, as was mentioned earlier, history in the US, in the UK, and other countries where these kinds of measures have been put into place, that Muslim communities and mainstream Muslim community organizations are often unjustifiably the main target and the main suspicious community within these kinds of surveillance policies, when actually groups like far-right extremist groups, particularly anti-Islam groups, tend to be treated with kid gloves on in some ways. So oftentimes there is a kind of a mismatch between perception and reality about who is deemed a suspicious community. And I did also want to make a point that was mentioned earlier. Vulnerability is absolutely not about poverty. Vulnerability to radicalization, there's a whole complex set of factors that might lead someone into an extremist group. It could be about the strength of ties to your family. It could be about a lack of ambition, or it could be about overambition and a sense that that within the country you're in, you will never be able to achieve your ambitions. It could be a feeling of discrimination. It's a whole complex set of factors that lead someone into these groups. And actually, those factors are best dealt with through social means, through much softer tactics than simply the hard end security intelligence approach. Yes, you need that end of the spectrum, but we also should be investing in much more community-led initiatives and also social service-led initiatives to engage directly with those that are vulnerable or are already in these movements.
I'd like to give Renard a chance to get in on this. What right of resort does an individual have under this law if they feel that they've been unfairly targeted, or other individuals who feel, for example, their security is being threatened by other extreme groups, far-right groups, which are not being sufficiently surveyed and targeted? What action does this law allow an individual to take in that circumstance?
I mean, first, you have been speaking of potential evils, but you have actual evils. I mean, what happened in September 2001, the problem is not that people had been too much monitored. The problem has been that people had been monitored by policemen, by FBI people, but the FBI reported to Washington were not heard. For instance, these agents of FBI had seen the strange attitude of these people learning to fly without being interested in landing, and they happened to do 11th of September several weeks after. So the problem was not of too much monitoring. The problem is that there was there's not enough monitoring, or not the belief that Washington. So
hang on, I'm not sure I'm following your argument here.
Own policemen.
It sounds like you're saying there isn't a problem with surveillance. If surveillance isn't the problem, will more surveillance solve what sounds to me like you're saying there's a problem with political will in making a decision? Why bring out a law to bring in more surveillance for that then, if these guys were already under surveillance, as you said?
No, the thing that they want to, the police services wanted to have a legal frame, because everything is based on law in France, so this is one point. The second point, that I don't believe that anyone, if I am listened to, I will not be targeted, I will not know it. If what is typed on my conversation is used against me in a professional matter or in a personal matter, this is another question. This is an abuse. If it's not used only for the purpose of the investigation, this is another thing. But if police does not abide by its own rules, it is another matter, which happened, of course, in America, in Abu Ghraib, in various places, or in this incident in Baltimore, for instance. Yes, police has to abide by its own rules. But if police abides by the law that has been voted, I mean, I don't see any problem. I mean, what you are speaking of potential, of virtual evils, and you are ignoring evils that exist. People have been killed in Paris. This is existing, okay? This is an evil that exists, okay? And the evil that you are talking of, that, like, for instance, France would be a country deprived of freedom, for the moment we don't feel it at all, and we don't feel the threat at all that there is that France, if you want to go out in the street and criticize the President of the Republic, there is no problem. Nothing will happen to you. So, but the problem now that we have in France, that newspapers, for instance, there are policemen in front of protecting my newspaper. Personally, I don't think it's very useful, but it's a fact that the people feel that there is a threat, though, so we have to address this threat, this real threat.
Right, but there's also, let me bring in Gowrie. There's also
evils.
Right, there is a what I'm referring to is not a hypothetical or potential. I mean, once again, you read the Europol reports, if 76% of actual terrorism is being committed by nationalist separatist groups, that's a very real threat and evil. If people, I'm wondering, how does someone get the chance to challenge and to bring that question to security agencies and say, how are you guys defining what is terrorism? How can I, as an individual, ask and make them accountable for, are they actually surveilling the sort of threats which may be targeting parts of the population which are not so powerful? Does this law give you the basis to do that?
No, it doesn't, is the clear answer. I mean, basically, one of the major criticisms of this law is the lack of definition. It's unclear exactly what these purposes mean, what falls under it, and it's frankly a carte blanche. I think it requires a lot of trust in the government, which in principle is a laudable thing, but to say that this is only an abstract threat, I really want to zoom in on that, because privacy matters. This is not just about a vague idea of intrusion of privacy. It matters in practice. Privacy matters, freedom of expression matters. This law can have very concrete impact on people. You mentioned before that we won't see sort of tracing, monitoring of journalists. That's incorrect. Under this law, it's possible to, in fact, monitor communication, traffic, internet use of journalists if there is any suspicion of activities on the other end of the communication by whoever they're communicating with. So that's one group. Violent demonstrations is one of the, or violence in public spaces is one of the objectives. To end that is one of the objectives in the law. That means that we can see monitoring of groups organizing peaceful protests. Ultimately, what is the impact of this type of invasion of privacy on real lives of people? And I think we do need to think about
it. Okay, all right, very briefly, Joe, and then I'm going to give video a chance. 30 seconds.
So no, I think I'm just dreaming, because the lady just said that, the freedom of expression is endangered, is jeopardized in France. I'm just dreaming. The freedom of expression was done by, there was freedom of expression, there was a newspaper called Charlie Hebdo. I don't agree with the Charlie Hebdo. It's not my cup of tea, but we have freedom of expression. And these people, for their freedom of expression, have been killed.
All right, you've made that point.
Threat.
We've got about,
we've got
about 30 seconds left. And I want to give video.
Jeopardizing the freedom of expression. No,
got that point. Let's bring in video, because we've got 30 seconds left. Video, go ahead.
Sure. I just want to say I think it can be quite dangerous to talk about extremism solely in a kind of evil versus good sense. That takes us away actually from the real issues here, from what really does lead individuals down this path. Right. And this is all about, this happens at the individual level. I just want to make a point quickly.
Very briefly, video.
Very briefly, every time a far-right terrorist attack happens in Europe, we're constantly surprised. We're surprised, and we don't actually adjust our methods, our security methods, our policy methods.
Right.
Yet every time there is an Islamist extremist attack, we do. So we need to be ensuring here that we have a view across the ideological spectrum.
We're going to have to leave it there. Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you too, Vidya. Thank you, all of our guests, for your contributions. Very valuable in this episode of Inside Story. Gowrie van Gulik, Vidya Ramalinga, and Renard Jura. Iran. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can get in touch with us on our programme page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team, for now, it's goodbye.